Good morning, everybody. Was that all I got? Good morning, everybody. All right, that's great. All right, so John, thank you, John. You're going. So one of the things that's not really I get to do a lot, but Bill Gropp gets to do a lot is introduce these great colloquia. I get to do it today, and I'm really pleased to do that. I am going to kind of be the master of ceremonies here today. I'm going to bring up several folks before we get to the main speaker. But one of the things that I'm going to start with is how happy I am that John Wilkin, who is not my relative, but wanted to make sure everybody knew. Now, I might say later that John's my brother, but he's obviously doesn't have as much going here as I do, so he's done much better. But it is my pleasure to introduce John. And John, you are the interim vice chancellor for academic affairs and provost. That is the title. And as the chief academic officer, John oversees the Urbana campus's academic programs, policies, and priorities, which have been designed to ensure the quality of educational experience for students and to sustain an environment that encourages and supports academic excellence. Prior to assuming this role, which is a pretty important role, and we were just talking outside of how many meetings John actually has to go to every day, you were appointed as the Juanita J. and Robert E. Simpson Dean of Libraries in August of 2013. So in that role, John leads one of the largest academic research libraries in North America. Now, one of them, I'm hoping top 10 at least, maybe top 5, right? Top 3. All right, it's an even better number. So Illinois library faculty and academic professionals bring a strong research agenda to addressing the wide array of challenges that we face. Current initiatives include the establishment of a substantial research data service, efforts to shape new forms of scholarly communication, and leveraging Illinois' substantial collection for digitization and shared print initiatives. Provost Wilkin has earned graduate degrees in English from the University of Virginia and in library science from the University of Tennessee, as well as a bachelor's degree in literature from Antioch. Please join me in welcoming John, and let's have a round of applause.
Now, I'm sure a lot of you have problems with people spelling your name. I know it's not an uncommon thing, but I rarely meet people whose last name is Wilkin with an I and no S. And there's even a Facebook group where people start by saying, "Oh, you too, no S, no E," right? So it's a real thank you, Scott. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to NCSA and the organizers of this colloquium for inviting me to be part of the talk today. The NCSA colloquium series was launched a few years ago to pursue goals that are important to me, bringing leaders from big data, computing, research, the arts, and humanities together to discuss issues to enlighten, to spark innovation among researchers of all disciplines. As a comprehensive public research university, we're strongest when each of our parts is thriving. And when it comes to these large societal issues, such as how we interact with computing and data, it's important to have different forms of expertise and different viewpoints in the room. Clearly, that's the goal of this event. And as a member of the campus leadership team, it's inspiring to see this kind of rich dialogue and collaboration take place. NCSA has been a leader in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research on our campus for a very long time, and it's amazing what they've been able to accomplish by these collaborations. I think about the recently announced work on the HIV capsid, the work done with dance and visualization, just to name two. NCSA researchers really live out the Illinois mission of coming together to produce knowledge that benefits society. NCSA is joined by several other groups on campus who have the same aim. There's amazing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work being done across campus. Of course, the Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities, IPRH, my friends there, are a part of that, and I'd like to think that in my own area of the library, we do much to foster that kind of approach to research and scholarship. Doing this kind of work is tremendously important, but also challenging. We know that definitions of disciplines are rapidly changing, that lines blur, and that this challenges us in understanding and evaluating boundary-crossing research. It also takes effort and planning and resources to collaborate well, but we also know it's worth the effort. Let me say this as loudly and clearly as I can. The ability we've shown at Illinois to foster connections across disciplines is our strength. It's one of the things that keeps people here, and it results in remarkable research, creativity, and conclusions. And yet there's still more work to be done to make sure this kind of cross-fertilization is strong and that it reaches all parts of the Illinois academic community. If you have ideas on how we can do better, I do hope you'll share them with my office, with me, so that we can champion this kind of scholarship. I'm especially interested in today's talk because the area of how humans interact with technology is a personal and professional interest. These are important issues, and we need to think critically about them. I want to thank Dr. Shah for being here to give us perspective, and thank you for letting me be part of this event. Scott, back over to you.
Thanks, John. So I have to find that Facebook group because I'm not in that Facebook group, but it's pretty important, obviously. One of the things I also want to bring up real quick is how important Donna and the research and education group has been to what we do here for the interdisciplinary work at NCSA. Donna's been leading this group now for a year and a half, or a year, and we really took a strong foundation and we're growing it in new directions. So I'm really pleased to have Donna do that work. I also want to say I want to welcome Professor Anita Sechan, did I say that right? And she is an Associate Research Professor of Communications in the Department of Media and Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois. Anita is currently a 2017-2018 NCSA Faculty Fellow in the Culture and Society Research Cluster, a founder of the Recovering Prairie Futures Research Cluster, and a Senior Faculty Fellow with the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. My wife probably needs to get involved with that one. But and a faculty affiliate at the Illinois Informatics Institute. Anita is also the lead organizer of the Campus Design Dialogue series, and Anita will introduce our speaker today. So please, a nice warm round of clapping for Anita. Thanks, Anita.
So good morning, all. It's my distinct honor to get to introduce this morning's NCSA colloquium speaker, Dr. Nishant Shah, Dean of Research at Artes University in the Netherlands. Dr. Shah is co-founder of the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore, India, and is professor at the Institute of Culture and Aesthetics of Digital Media at Leuphana University in Germany, where he teaches in fields spanning digital humanities, human-computer interaction, and information and communication technologies for development. His work on technology, identity, and social movements has focused on the question of how we can remain human in a technological environment. And I should add that I've been following the work of Dr. Shah since I was a graduate student at MIT. And whether it was his work as co-founder of the Center for Internet and Society, his prolific research on everything from citizen action in information societies to digital natives and alternatives in network cities, or his scholarship now in critical data studies, Dr. Shah has long worked to forge new paths and define a cutting edge for interdisciplinary digital studies. Please join me in welcoming our speaker this morning, Dr. Shah.
All right, good morning. You are such a kind audience, or maybe I've just lived in Germany for way too long. We don't clap while the speaker comes onto the stage. We save it to say whether we like it or not. We do the clapping at the end of the thing, not at the beginning, but thank you for this warm, Midwestern American hospitality. And it's keeping in tune with what a wonderful and generous host the University of Illinois has been throughout this entire visit. I have spent an incredibly immersive one day meeting with, I think, 6 different units yesterday. And it's both the scale of it and the diversity of it is kind of a little mind-boggling. But it's very, very exciting to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. Today's talk, especially at the NCSA, this is like return to the mothership, so to speak, right? Because as I was just telling some colleagues right now, NCSA is in fact one of the things that we teach to students in Germany as one of the reference points of how humanities computing and computational humanities kind of started to come together for the first time in the history of kind of more computational cultures. So thank you so much for inviting me. I just want to give a shout out to Professor Anita Se-Chan and 2 of her research associates is Ned and Jorge, who have been really just pampering me and a little bit of babysitting me. I should not be let loose in the USA. So thank you so much for the hospitality, and I'm going to jump straight into my talk today. So I must confess that I have been struggling a lot trying to figure out how to position myself in front of you today. Because on the one hand, I think of computer science as one of my home disciplines, which it is. I worked as an information architect and a programmer in India and Europe for about a decade, and I have a huge affinity towards computing and logic. On the other hand, over the last few years, I have been trying to think of myself as a radical humanist and an unapologetic feminist, and have been very intrigued in asking human questions of programmed visions, and particularly looking at the ways in which the ambitions of computation come to the fore, right? And we know that these ambitions make themselves manifest in all kinds of ways, from networked societies to artificial intelligence life forms, and from algorithmic governance to smart homes. So I've been interested in how we continue to make the human question relevant and central to the computational futures that we build. And then I realized that even though these are often presented as either or choices, and we know these choices, like it's STEM over humanities, engineering versus literature, mathematics against logic, none of these are absolute contradictions. And it's perhaps more fruitful to draw from all of those different disciplines together and focus on the question that actually guides us. So I'm not going to try and pick a disciplinary side, but I will try and pick a question that I think I want to kind of focus on through this morning. And the question's not rocket science. It's a little harder. And let me try and spell it out for you. Very simply, it's this. Who are we when we talk to machines? Deceptively straightforward as this might be, we know that there is a very deep and contested history to this question. I'm going to resist the temptation again of making an easy choice, because the choices are actually available in visions of singularity, in productions of cyborgs, in descriptions of actor network theories, in interventions in maker cultures, developments in human-computer interaction, feminist epistemology of technology. There has been so much incredible work done in post-colonial computing, queer algorithms, software studies, hacker cultures, and the new focus on the Internet of Things, where the question of human subjectivity in computational networks has been addressed and often presented as resolved, right? We kind of know where we are when it comes to computing. So instead of offering a resolution, I will try and look at the particular question of how the human becomes a user. And I think this is an important distinction to maintain, of how the human becomes a user when we talk with machines, and how the history of the user is actually a history only of the machine and does not allow us to think of the human question in computing conversations. So this talk has 2 premises. The first deals with how the user is positioned in the discourse around user design and computation development, and how it seems to shut down the possibility of asking human questions in computing terrains. I'm going to show through one very, very, very personal and anecdotal incident how the question of the human are not the same as the questions of the user. and how the design of the user has not taken into account the questions of the human. The second part draws from 3 snapshots to show how an alternative and an arbitrary history of computing that begins with the human rather than the user might offer us a new mode of thinking about questions of politics and policies in the digital terrain. So the first premise begins with my grandmother. She turned 84 last week and has possibly, with consent but also unwittingly, been my research collaborator in looking at everyday practices of the digital. And she's perhaps the figurehead of the human conversations we have with our computing devices. So in the last few years, she's taken up digital devices with an enthusiasm that challenges the kind of Peter Pan narrative of a digital native, right? When you think of a digital user, it's always an infantile, childish, young user who kind of navigates through the technologies. I'm almost certain my grandmother would put them all to the shame. So this summer, when I was visiting her in our conversation, she decided to dig out an old picture of her childhood home that she had once found online. She fired up her iPad, went on to Google, and started laboriously typing out queries which would have given us the result. So she types in Gujarati, which is her first language. She's not really English literate, but she still has to use an English language keyboard because in India, we don't have any localization of hardware. So if you want to write in any of the 16 languages in India, the only input device you have is an English language keyboard, and then you have a software layer which kind of converts your English keystrokes into a Gujarati font. So generally, her interaction with computing is already quite slow, right? So I waited kind of patiently while controlling my instincts to just grab the iPad, type up the query, and get the result that was needed, and I waited, saying let her do it on her own pace. But we were 10 minutes into the search query, and my grandmother had sunk into silence, typing away, completely ignoring me, and still there was no result. So eventually, impatience got the better of the pedagogue in me, and I looked over her shoulders to see what was taking so long, only to realize that my grandmother was having a detailed conversation with Google. As I scanned through the transcript, I realized that every time my grandmother starts a search query, she begins by greeting her search algorithm, inquiring how it's feeling today, then explaining the reason why she had come to ask her question. In the 10 minutes, she had talked about the weather, her aching knees, how she's so happy that her grandson is visiting her, and she was typing a brief précis of our conversation, and she was finally going to ask her question. The sheer effort of this search practice left me speechless. Like eventually, after about 20 minutes, when my grandmother finally asked the engine to go and fetch the image of the address that she had in mind, we finally got to see her childhood home, and she beamed at me in joy, having successfully completed the cybernetic feedback loop of talking with her Google. So, astounded at this incredible performance of a search query, I spent some time trying to explain to my grandmother that all she had to do in the future is to type the keywords of what she's searching for, and answers would just appear. And with great disappointment in her eyes, she said, "You were not raised to be like that. You have to be nice if you are asking for help." It took some more time to explain to her that there was nobody behind her iPad, or at least no human person there, at which she said, "That's not true, because 2 of my cousins actually work with Google. So obviously there are people working for it to help her find the answers." And she also kind of fails to see the distinction of why you should not be nice when you are talking to your machines. She reminds me, in fact, that her birthday in the Indian lunar calendar falls on this day called Dhanteras, which is a very auspicious day devoted to the goddess of wealth and prosperity. And as a part of the rituals of the day, the devices, implements, and tools of trade and commerce are worshipped, and there is a ritualistic contract which is made with them about how, if I'm nice to my tools of trade, they are going to gain prosperity for me. And even if it is a machine, she insisted, it doesn't hurt to be nice. To her, the iPad, like any other machine that she is used to, is in a conversation with her. And she enjoys the fact that she now gets to see the inner spirit of her devices, and insists that because she is nicer in her queries, she gets better results than my rude commands that I throw into the search engine. This particular story of my grandmother, which I am sharing only with consent, These interactions with search algorithms is a rupture in the design dialogues around the user and the machine, and especially the digital interfaces. Because from the point of view of any discourse on design and computation, and you can throw this at any user experience engineer, anybody who is doing digital literacy, they would immediately think of my grandmother as an inefficient, poorly literate, ineffective user who needs to be trained to become a better user of digital technologies. In my own position as a pedagogue in these spheres, I almost immediately identified my grandmother's practices as poor or in need of correction. However, she resists that categorization and instead insists that it's important to bring into our computational conversation the notions of niceness, identifying the labor of algorithms, the politics of politeness, and the need of care in a discipline and discourse that seems to have almost an antagonistic value when it comes to these affective states. The idea of a nice user is so alien that, in fact, me and 3 of my very reluctant grad students have spent the entire summer trying to find one book, be it a textbook in computer sciences, be it a history of computing, be it any kind of user-generated user interface or design ideas. We're trying to find one book where it says that niceness is a precondition of becoming a user of the digital. And it's not a surprise that we haven't found anything yet. If you do know of a reference, please let us know. But within the user design discourse, we almost immediately presume that the user is a universal template that naturally comes into being, and user design is about designing the experience of the user in its interaction with the technologies, particularly technologies that interact through the aesthetics of a graphical user interface. Thus, user design invokes, personalization, customization, individualization, where each of the principle, again, invokes the idea of a benign world that is being built around the user, who is a Disneyfied natural entity. So much so that even the critique of user design only concentrates on the ways in which the technologies are developed and the larger logics that inform the mind-jacking designs of user behavior, for example. And the imagination of the user as a natural category eliminates the idea that the user is not a pre-given or a de facto one. It doesn't account for the human and affective engagements of my grandmother, whose history of usership comes from other traditions. It also doesn't allow for the non-user to be what William Gibson in his science fiction dystopia would have called a legitimate operator. So I want to propose today that the way we understand the processes of computing design as transforming the human into a user is crucial in understanding how we will be safeguarding, defending, championing, and cherishing the idea and ideologies of being human, be it the data subject or the quantified self, that we have built across the last decades. I want to draw attention to the fact that the epistemologies of computation technologies and design reinforce that there is no gap between the human subject and the user within computation cultures. But for those of us who do read network theory, for example, and specifically physical computation networks, we remember that Duncan Watts, in his fantastic book called The Small World Phenomenon, points out that if we imagine the human through the metaphor of the nodes in a network, it's already a problem. This is a fallacy because to those of us who do network design, we understand that the network is agnostic to the well-being of its nodes. Right? The network doesn't care whether a node is going to live or die. In fact, we think that it is the strength of computational networks that if a node collapses, something else is going to come and stand in its stead, and so it's always going to be resilient, right? That's why we think that the internet can never really be shut down. Because if you clamp down on one node, another node can be activated to perform exactly the same functions without affecting the flow of traffic within physical computation networks. And Duncan Watts, who is in fact a physical computation networker himself, insists that we need to stop making a direct correlation between the human user as a node within the network. Because if you think of the human user merely through the node and the network metaphor, what you essentially have is a disposable idea of the human being. That each one is unique in its customized entity, but entirely replaceable when she is not really needed within the logic and logistics of that network computing. So, despite these kinds of, let's say, warning signs or cautions, in most computation histories and conversations, we begin with the user, mapped onto these network nodes as a given naturalized entity. In fact, so strong is the seduction of the user that those who do not conform to these conventions are seen as the have-nots, so think about the global south, or the digital pariahs, think about the last mile, or indeed criminals who need to be rehabilitated from their pathology of disconnectedness to be made computable as users. The user is so central a category of thinking within computation design that even when we discover the hidden figures in the making of the everything machine, we grant them usership. So we look at the recovery, for example, of women computers in the 1960s working within mainframe computing, and we think of them as users, whereas they were categorically not users. They were makers, they were tinkerers, they were hackers, they were operators, they were all kinds of different things. But post facto computer design insists that the only way of thinking about them is through the imagination of the user. Right? So the design of computing by and large presumes the user as a given and as a naturally originary point. And yet, every time we seek to talk of the user, we eventually talk of the device. Because the story of the user begins only in her interaction with the device. Much like the node in a computational network, the user does not pre-exist the device. The user gets activated because of her interactions with the device. Right? And in this quest for trying to find a space for my grandmother in the histories of computing, but especially in human-computer interaction practices, I started looking at the idea of the user and the human as two different things. And the more we read of the histories of technology, the more we realized that they have always been about the history of the technological. So that even when we are recovering these hidden figures and unpacking the black box of people in computing, we continue to make the move where we shift from the human to the user, and every time we say the user, we actually mean technology. Our history of computing is blind to those who could not be made computable. It is silent on the history of those who were computed and the roles they played in the material preservations and engagements of technology. And today I want to offer not a comprehensive history because I'm not trained as a historian, but 3 snapshots from the history of computing to talk about the computed. Right, the human who was counted, or the human who was who could not often take the affordances of being counted. And I offer this history of the computed as a way of resisting this human-user conflation and addressing the processes of contestation, coercion, correction, and containment that are written on the bodies of the human, which needs to be computed. So let's begin with the first story. It begins in 1835, which seems like a good historical point to talk about the history of computing, and it refers to somebody called Thomas Babington Macaulay, a man whose name can only be explained by the fact that his parents could not have loved him enough. Macaulay, in a document titled In the Minutes on Education, argued that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. For Macaulay, the native pagan was marked as a subject who has a past, but not a history, and hence needs to be educated in English to become the middleware for a smooth administration of the British Empire. Macaulay's bastards, as they are derisively called in India, became the first instance of a modern user that was produced by the bastardized technocracy of a colonized governance uniting with the codes and codexes of knowledge making. It draws to our attention that the user has a much closer relationship with the politics of governance and exclusion than with the processes of literacy and interpretation. Because instead of importing the books of the great literates from England to India and teaching the pagan to read and write great literature and appreciate great English ethics, Macaulay introduced 2 forms in the formal education structure in India. The ledger and the Indian Penal Code. And let me spend a little bit of time on this. So in this particular time-looped video installation from the Rux Artist Collective in New Delhi, the video installation is called An Unfrozen Archival Afternoon, Unregistered on the Richter Scale. The installation shows us surveyors who were the ledger keepers, the accountants, who were keeping count of the wealth and the resources of the British East India Company. The accounting system was not only meant to codify the domination of the British Empire, but also was a way by which the pagan could get counted. This picture of surveyors in Bengal reminds us that the most dominant genre of usership has always been through systems of the ledger, of profits and balances, of incomes and expenses, of different ways by which traffic has to be flown, and the user becomes the node through which the traffic is going to flow. It reminds us that the infrastructural trace of information that balances on both sides to maintain a state of equilibrium has actually been the best metaphor to understand the user, because the ledger made us intelligible and produced us as legible, right? The ledger allowed us to be counted, and then it allowed us to be put into systems of counting which were not our own. And so we could become then legitimate operators of the British Empire. But what is present in this visual is Macaulay's commitment to design the Indian pagan to become a legitimate user, a true honorable Britishman. And in the interest of this transformation, along with the ledger, Macaulay introduced the Indian Penal Code that obsessively sought to regulate the orgiastic practices of the native. He formulated something called the Unnatural Sexual Acts Law, something that still remains in the Indian Penal Code as Section 377, which criminalized all sexual acts except for the penal vaginal intercourses that were intended for procreation. One of which, it also introduced a series of guidelines on how to curb the homoerotic excesses of the Indian pagan. One of which was to create boundaries in closed spaces, not allowing for the unclean male bodies to touch each other, thus succumbing to the temptation of the flesh. These boundaries became the blueprint of how much space must be maintained between two men in a close working environment so that they can concentrate on their work, restraining their libidinal desire and resisting the urge to break into song, dance, and sodomy. The image loop, as it moves from light to dark, also illustrates the possibility of a homoerotic camaraderie that Macaulay imagined in the unsupervised offices of work. Because it was only when the native was taught to count and be counted, to compute and be computed. And once the pagan was trained to understand the penal implications of his penile desires, that the native could understand the value of literature and the power of poetry that invited him to wander lonely as a cloud and chance upon a host of daffodils. That in order for the native to become a user and a part of a legitimate usership, capable of the acts of reading and interpretation, a massive design principle of accounting and policing had to come into being. The history of the computed then will have to engage not just with the interface between the user and the interface of the larger systems of computing and counting, but also to conditions of counting, accounting, discounting, and miscounting, which the human is often subjected to in producing her as a Pakka Sahib. The second story I want to offer you is around piracy. When we think of a user, there is a certain gentrification of politics that is always kind of in the background. The user in the digital turn is always somebody who's on the right side of the law, with ethical impulses, motivated by the desire to do good, and fighting the rights of the commons. But when we turn to the digital, the stories get blurred sometimes. Let me illustrate this through the possibility of perhaps the most scandalous public archive and the fight for free speech and expression in India, and this is the story of Savita Bhabhi. I don't know if this is an image which is familiar to you, or if you come across this particular campaign, but Savita Bhabhi, and this is one of the instances from the graphic novel, Bhabhi is the Hindi word for sister-in-law. But it's used generously for almost any married woman of a certain age, right? So if you're meeting a colleague and his wife, then you basically refer to his wife as Bhabhi immediately, because we're all one big family, as you know. It's an affectionate term of endearment for even those that are not related by marriage. And Savita Bhabhi became an iconic cartoon figure erupting on the Indian internet in 2008. It was created under the pseudonym of Deshmukh, which is the voice of the nation. the first adult comic strip series on the website savitabhabi.com, and it depicted the life of a lonely Indian housewife who had fantasies-filled and fantastic adulterous experiences with different men in the absence of a husband who is always traveling or working. In many ways, the Savita Bhabhi comic strips followed the standard tropes of adult fantasy encounters that one might have found in pornographic letters in heterosexual adult entertainment magazines like Playboy and Penthouse in the USA, for example, or indeed in the pulp fiction that's available on the side streets of a printed bookshop in India. What was startlingly new about the comic strip, this online comic strip, was the setting of the Indian family and the tropes of transgression that the central married female character embodies. Across the 51 stories published under this moniker, the comic strip uses the site of the home and the family as a space of sexual promiscuity and encounters of fantasy. The emergence of an Indian body in Indian settings, in circumstances that seemed more real than the clandestine pornography with foreign bodies, made the comic strip an overnight viral sensation. For over a year, Savita Bhabhi became the new face of Indian pornographic expression, where bodies like ours were suddenly installed as actors in a fantasy rather than mere consumers for it. In 2008, it was the third most visited Indian website from within South Asia. It received many accolades from national media for representing a new sexually empowered, unapologetic female protagonist who embodied the liberating sexual mores of a largely conservative country. It also saw a large amount of public critique and controversy as conservative activists filed petitions and speculated on the harm of obscene cartoons to the children who are the imagined audience of this comic strip. In 2009, the sexual adventures of Savita Bhabhi were called to an abrupt halt when the Department of Telecommunications at the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology issued an order asking all internet service providers to block access to this website. Under the law, the owners of the website would have no chance to appeal the ban, but that would have required, the only way to appeal the ban would have been for the pseudonymous author to reveal who he really is and out himself as the pervert number one of the country, who's basically depicting these specific encounters, right? So initially there was nobody to claim the ownership of Savita Bhabhi, and the internet was agog with concerns about freedom of speech and expression as the cyberspace in India becomes more regulated. Eventually the main creator of the website, his name is Punit Agrawal, who is a second generation Indian in London, took responsibility for the website and started a hashtag called Save Our Savita Bhabhi. A campaign which kind of garnered a lot of public interest in order to support the removal of the ban. However, the campaign lost its teeth because Punit's mother told him that if he goes ahead with this, she's going to kill himself. Like melodrama at the fore, right? Like Indian mothers to the rescue. So she just insisted that if she continued on this path, she's not going to talk to him and she's going to go unto a Gandhian fast unto death. And so that was the end of that story. And as soon as the official death was announced and Punit kind of withdrew from this particular case, multiple archives of the entire collection of Savita Bhabhi strips emerged online. Savita Bhabhi got presented in different formats and was shared on P2P torrent networks. She was animated and preserved in videos that documented the comic strips. The strips were narrativized by people and shared. Memes around Savita Bhabhi became popular, using both her name and her form as a part of the social exchange on the internet. In fact, the shutting down of the website made sure that the internet pornographers suddenly became internet archivists and activists. In times when digital storage is almost infinite and copying from the web is easy, it turned out that multiple offline archives of the Savita Bhabhi comic strips were lurking on the dark web and were suddenly made available to be shared. Even as the law shut down the website and the original creators were unable to afford the social and cultural infrastructure that was needed to sustain this archive, the pervert who was consuming these adult fantasies suddenly became an activist and an archivist, allowing for a new imagination of the user to come into being. Because the story of Savita Bhabhi and the figure of the perverted archivist storing data and restoring it when it appears is the story both of degeneration of digital archives and the libidinal excesses that animate our affective and personal investment in the interventions that we make. We need to realize that this specific user, who is right now the strongest ally in India for the fight for free speech and expression, is essentially a pervert. right? When it came to the taxonomy of the users that we would have desired within the digital spaces of India, this usership would not have found any legitimacy. It would always have been thought of those bad people who do weird things when they are on the internet. And yet here was a particular instance of a human excessive libidinal affective investment into pornography, which allowed for these people to to become the champions of free speech and expression or activisms in India. And the last story I have for you is of a different kind of a pervert, but not the perverts of the Savita Bhabhi archivist kinds, right? So who were also kind of pirates more than perverts, but the perverts of the like that you have never imagined. So in most of our imagination of users, we generally not only think of a human user, but a particular kind of human user. The imagination of the forms of change, formats of information, tropes of engagement are severely limited and formulaic in many of these current practices. And I wanted to kind of show you the imagination of a user of a very different kind. This draws from the first history of the history of cybernetics, well, at least the first order of cybernetics, and this is the story of a stalker dolphin. I don't know if people are familiar with this particular history, but in the 1950s, John C. Lilly, who basically scammed the US government under the biggest hoax there was possible, got a multi-million-dollar grant to build what he called a dolphinarium on US Virgin Islands, where he spent his precious research budgets largely consuming huge amounts of LSD and proposing that this woman called Margaret, who is an animal behavior scientist, goes to cohabitate and live with a bottlenose dolphin called Peter. And the experiment was designed entirely to say that if aliens land tomorrow on Earth, how are we going to break interspecies communication and teach them how to speak English, right? So Margaret and Peter are basically asked to live together in a house for 6 weeks, and Margaret is supposed to teach Peter, because the dolphin is the mammal with the largest brain computation power, and so it might be easier to teach it how to speak English. So Margaret lives with Peter for about 6 weeks, and she keeps her diaries. It's a house that is half land, half water. They even sleep together, so she's sleeping on a hammock, and Peter is down below with her. Margaret's diaries actually just got released 3 years ago. And we started a very strange story because the entire setup was that of a bestial conjugality. Margaret and Peter were supposed to build a home together as if they were a newly married couple. And it so happened that by the time it was week 4, Peter fell in love with Margaret. Not only was he sexually aroused every time he was close to her, but he also refused to go and mate with the female dolphins who were made available to him for release of sexual tension. He would playfully bite at Margaret's ankles. He would keep on bumping into her. He's a huge dolphin, and he would keep on bruising her at all times. And Margaret was really scared at that point, because Peter, for her, had taken up the form of a quintessential stalker. He followed her everywhere. He continued to press his advances on her when she refused about it. And in fact, at some point, because she was scared that he will just snap her into two, she goes to John C. Lilly and she tells him that there is a problem here and she doesn't know what to do about it. And in her diaries, as they say, John C. Lilly encouraged Margaret to take matters in her own hands. That's literally the sentence that he uses. Right? He actually says that in order for interspecies communication to break through and to make Peter into a legitimate user of technologies of speech and language, Margaret might just want to masturbate him now and then. Right? This was basically a part of a scientific experiment, and this was proposed as one of the most misogynist, for example, experimental tools that was being advised at this particular point. So this particular story of the woman who lived with the dolphins, and there is an incredible BBC4 documentary which has now been made with it. It's called The Woman Who Lived with the Dolphins, and it has interviews with Margaret, who's still alive, and who eventually married the photographer who took these pictures of Margaret with Peter. It's a beautiful story. But this is a story of also imagining all our current cultural and theoretical practices of the user as flawed and futile, because we think of the user only through certain imaginations of personhood, of privileges, of affordances and positions of the imagined human. the idea of the dolphin as the unintended recipient of our communication might offer a completely different form of our visions of change and understanding what constitutes a user within the digital network. The dolphin for Lily was just a figurehead standing in for the extraterrestrial encounters in outer space. But if we understand the dolphin as that unimaginable user who will have to be made sense of, who will need to be computed, and perhaps in Lily's experiments masturbated into becoming a user, is the kind of perversion and paranoia that is not present in the history of the computed. So what do I want to do with these three stories? I want to shift the focus of our conversations when talking about the user to that instead of the instrumental relationships about distribution, access, amplification, circulation, I'm arguing that there is a more sinister interplay of power and protocol, of algorithms and actors, of networks and performances that needs to be unpacked in order to think about political futures and social histories that create the digital user. I'm proposing that when we concentrate only on the expected user, we forget to look at the larger nexus of technological design, interface intentions, and digital impulses that exclude and discriminate against several groups of people who remain invisible in the circuits of digital networking. And I want to conclude today by suggesting that when talking about infrastructure, actions, agents, and intentions, we need to focus not on how things happen, but who is allowed to participate, and what are the kinds of ways in which their participation is subject to policing and penalizing, and how this infrastructure kind of gets set into place. In the end, I want to perhaps imagine that the users that we are talking about are not just people marching on streets or explicitly engaging in Facebook interactions, but that my grandmother who strives to be nice in her attempts to being a user, the bodies that cannot bear the risk of protecting themselves, the pagan who had to be counted before making it accountable, the pervert who saves the archive through his libidinal excess, and the dolphin who demanded a new mode of knowledge interaction are all examples which remind us that the human is not just a gesture that we make in computing, that it is time perhaps to think of a history of the computed, to look at those who are not legible to the logics and logistics of digital computation and governance, to think about the future of where our network societies are going to go. I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much.
So I think we have some time for some questions.
Sure.
So if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Nishant, I've got to say, that was one of the most different talks we've ever had here at NCSA. So I really appreciate that. You had me. I listened to the whole thing.
Thank
it was
you.
good. But wow. So does your grandma know about the dolphin? She does. Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions out there?
My grandma's response to that was, I've heard worse.
Oh. Any questions? Well, I've got the shot. Right there.
Yes.
There's a microphone. Right here.
Oh, thank you. I was just thinking about the activation of the device by the presence of the user. And it occurs to me that I study storytelling, and it occurs to me that there are other metaphors that we might use that have a similar quality of only happening when two entities are in relationship. I'm not sure yet what this means. This is really something I wanted to ask you about, if you had thought at all about, in that, had you thought about metaphors? Activate is one. Have you thought about other metaphors that might help illuminate better this focus, which I agree with, on the user and the device? And I'm wondering, because of what I study, whether storytelling as an exchange between the teller, the tale, and the audience might be one of them. So,
thank you. I think that's such a interesting kind of intervention into this space. I haven't really gone beyond just being uncomfortable with the user in my work right now. But I think storytelling is a great example of the shift that we are experiencing with the production of the user. Because within storytelling, so if we were to make let's say a very bad technological generalization, the interesting part about storytelling is that the origin of meaning resides within the human, and the materialization of the meaning is also the human, which means that if there is a feedback loop in storytelling, it is first the pre-existing human beings, and then there has been an effort an effort has to be made to kind of bring them into a conversation. When it comes to the user, the origin is the technology, and the haptic feedback loop is also the technology. Right? That within storytelling, the efficacy of a story is in figuring out if the person who told the story and person who received the story actually are now coming together to co-create meaning. Whereas within the digital networks right now, the measure of efficacy begins with, let's say, artificial intelligence, and it ends with artificial intelligence. Right? The measure of computing is computing. The measure of computing can never be a human being. But if you force the human being to take up the responsibilities of now reifying meaning, then it's a problem. So in fact, storytelling is one way of doing it. I think one of the more interesting ways that I've come across, at least within digital ethnographies, is sense making. Right? About how do you bring in sense, which is not really sensibility, to make a very Jane Austen distinction. Right? How do you bring sense into a conversation with machines which can only be sensible? How do you talk about conditions of neurosis, of fragility, of vulnerability, of my resistance to be counted, of different conditions which cannot really fall into the logics of computation? And where is that history? How do we kind of... So because a lot of history writing right now has been about rescuing, let's say, gendered bodies, sexualized bodies, sexual minorities, people of color, and so on into that particular history, but they are still treated only as users. Right? Their human conditions, the larger conditions of, let's say, life and love, which they also kind of embody within these different interventions. So, one of the ways in which we teach Alan Turing, for example, is that he's always the father of artificial intelligence, and he also accidentally happened to be gay. And that's the end of it. But it's not really that way. Maybe there is a certain affective condition of queerness and of oppression that makes Turing actually have affinity to think about machines in a different way, and that needs to be kind of rescued, and that's the movement away from the user. So if we want to stick to the user, I don't mind it, but then can we have a user plus plus and see what happens when we try and engage with those kinds of phenomenon, because that's also essentially the future of quantified self. I mean, Facebook is really not interested in everything that can be counted about you. It's especially interested in those things which cannot be counted about you, right? And that's going to be an interesting conversation to have for the future. So thanks for the question. I don't really know if I have an answer of what other metaphors to use for that.
Thank you. I just have one question. You are talking about India, and I want to know if how is your approach to information and communication technologies for development? What can we bring by shifting from user to human? And also to ask if human is also a category that has to be like deconstructed or unpacking, because you were showing Macaulay like essentially was a humanist, so human has also like this kind of value that can be also be unpacked, or is something that you are hitting also there?
Thank you. And this allows me to kind of reinforce the idea that I'm not a romantic humanist. I don't want to now, all of us, to run away with the idea of how wonderful the category of the human is. But the point is that we at least have a critical discourse of how problematic the human is. Right? The entire discourse of rights, of jurisdiction, of entitlements, protection, privacy, governance, regulation, at least has allowed us to produce safeguards in trying to preserve whatever this romantic idea of the human has to be. The user within ICT4D, that's Information and Communication Technologies for Development, has been reduced to becoming an innocent category which is absolved of all the responsibilities of the human being. So when we activate a certain notion of the user within, let's say, India, which has to be connected by 2020, what we are essentially saying is that earlier histories and legacies of caste-based discrimination, religious persecution, poverty, of inequality no longer exist, because once you are a user, you are all the same, right? You are all exactly the same in exactly the same way. I don't know if you have ever looked at somebody who comes from a different country and a different language using any of the interfaces that you are familiar with. I do a lot of work in East Asia with China and Taiwan, and it's really fascinating to see that my Facebook and their Facebook have nothing in common, like absolutely nothing in common, except for the ugly white and blue interface. There is nothing in common between the two. But so this idea of the human being allows us to get to the promise of diversity, right? And one of the things that the human engenders is this continuous demand of diversity that we put in. The promise of the user is the diversity, but what it delivers is scale. It just gives you a magnitude. It gives you a largely quantified set of people who are going to be able to engage with these things, but they are exactly the same kind of people. That's both the presumption and the promise. And that's particularly detrimental to the imagination of ICT4D portfolios, because essentially the only legitimate user that we will accept within the state-sponsored, let's say, internet connectivity is the kind of user who is sanctioned by the state. I mean, I don't want to start ranting about it, but the easiest problematic example of this would be internet.org, right? A not-for-profit or an alleged not-for-profit which is powered by giants like Facebook, Microsoft, Nokia, and Apple, who go into third world countries and they reduce the human into becoming nothing more than a user, forcing entire countries to step out of agreements of net neutrality and zero rating, allowing for a discriminatory internet to be the default internet within those countries. So the shift from the human to the user allows for these kinds of state regulation and state agreements to be dismantled in different ways. But we can talk about internet.org forever if you want. We've been doing an ethnography of them for the last 5 years, and there's lots of interesting stories to tell.
Any more questions? Well, let's thank Nishant.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.